Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today because, well, we are tackling a genuinely fascinating dilemma in the world of artificial intelligence right now. We're diving into episode 2 of our hardware series, the 3-bit inference trade off. Basically, we're looking at this relentless, ongoing battle between memory capacity and processing throughput when you're deploying large language models. Okay, let's dive right into this, because there's a highly intuitive, but honestly incredibly dangerous assumption floating around the AI engineering space right now. It basically goes like this. If we compress our data to be as tiny as possible, say squishing it all the way down to just 3 bits, it's got to move through the hardware faster, right? Smaller data equals faster inference. Makes total sense. Well, today, we are going to completely pull back the curtain on how computation actually works, and you'll see why pushing for maximum KV cache compression absolutely does not guarantee faster speeds. So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the root cause, the KV cache memory bottleneck. Then, we'll bust the compression speed myth. Next, we'll see why 4-bit sits in the competitive middle, before exposing the hidden dangers of 3-bit in what I call the dequantization trap. Finally, we'll establish the FP8 performance baseline and deliver our final inference verdict. Starting off with Section 1, the KV cache memory bottleneck and silicon's rigid limits. To really understand why we're even trying to compress this data in the first place, we have to move down into the actual hardware and look at the rigid physical constraints of modern silicon architecture. At the heart of almost all modern computers is the von Neumann architecture, which basically means the processor is physically separated from the memory. Now, when you have an AI evaluating literally billions of parameters, this creates a massive data traffic jam. We call this the memory wall bottleneck. Your super fast processor literally has to sit there completely idle, waiting for model weights and the KV cache, which holds the context of previous tokens, to be shuttled back and forth across physical copper wires. You're burning a massive amount of energy and time just moving electrical currents around, rather than actually doing the math. This memory pressure, it's the absolute binding constraint in production LLM environments. Moving on to Section 2, the compression speed myth, or the illusion that smaller automatically means faster. Engineers naturally want to compress that KV cache to relieve this pressure, right? And Google's TurboQuant algorithm recently gained a ton of traction for doing exactly that. In fact, if you look at the 3-bit variant of TurboQuant, specifically the 3-bit-INC configuration, it achieves a staggering 3.7x capacity multiplier compared to the standard uncompressed BF16 baseline. On paper, this looks like an absolute miracle. You can suddenly fit nearly 4 times as many concurrent user requests into the exact same GPU memory. If memory is your bottleneck, you'd probably think you just found the ultimate silver bullet. And this brilliantly illustrates the central illusion we're exposing today. When VLM researchers ran a comprehensive systems-level analysis on massive models like Qwen30B and Llama 70B, they found that lower storage cost definitely does not translate directly into faster serving. The data speaks for itself. While the baseline runs at 100% throughput, the 4-bit variant drops to about 85%. And that extreme 3-bit variant, it completely crashes down to just 50% throughput. By pushing compression to the absolute maximum, you're actually slashing your processing speed by up to 52%. Which brings us to Section 3, 4-bit, the competitive middle, and balancing capacity with compute. Let's look at why this happens by examining the middle ground first, where the trade-offs are actually manageable. The 4-bit TurboQuant variant, known as 4-bit-NC, acts as a really compelling sweet spot here. It still gives you an impressive 3.0x gain in memory capacity, which is absolutely vital if you are running inference in memory-constrained setups, like edge devices or smaller local servers. And for that huge memory relief, you pay a moderate throughput cost. You sacrifice about 15 to 25% of your speed with only a modest 1 to 2% drop in accuracy. It's a very practical trade-off if memory is your absolute biggest constraint. But then we hit Section 4, 3-bit, the dequantization trap. Let's talk about the zip file analogy. So, what happens when we get greedy and push past 4-bit to those 3-bit variants? Well, this is where the whole system begins to break down. We enter the dequantization trap. You see, unlike hardware-native operations, TurboQuant only compresses the storage. It's exactly like a heavily compressed zip file. Sure, it takes up very little space on your hard drive, but you can't just run a program while it's still zipped. Think about the sequence here. Step 1, the system fetches that tiny 3-bit chunk. Step 2, it must dynamically unzip, or dequantize, that data back into a readable 16-bit format. Only then, in Step 3, can it dispatch it to the floating point unit for actual math. This continuous, relentless unzipping process takes serious time. Now, what's really interesting here is just how huge that penalty is in practice. That runtime dequantization step adds up to a 68% latency overhead, depending on your batch size. The more aggressive the compression, the more mathematically complex that unpacking process becomes. So your multi-thousand-dollar lightning-fast GPU is suddenly acting like a stressed-out office clerk, spending all its time just desperately trying to unzip folders instead of actually generating text. And the hardware itself absolutely hates this. Let's think about the two sides of a computer's physical brain. On one side, we have the arithmetic logic unit, the surveyor. It performs exact, verified, deterministic math. 1 plus 1 is exactly 2. But AI relies heavily on the floating point unit, or the FPU. The FPU is a gambler. It's designed to be fast and lossy, throwing darts to give you an incredibly quick approximation for continuous vector spaces. When you force continuous meaning through an extreme, lossy 3-bit arbitrary chunk just to save memory, you introduce a severe modality mismatch. The FPU simply cannot properly manage or extract accurate data resolution from such extreme arbitrary chunks. And here is the devastating real-world consequence of starving the FPU. When researchers tested those 3-bit variants on decode-heavy reasoning benchmarks, the results were brutal. The 3-bit models triggered a solid 4-point drop on the Math 500 benchmark and suffered a catastrophic collapse on hard reasoning and coding tasks like AMY 25. By pushing the silicon past its natural resolution limits, you literally destroy the model's ability to perform high-level logic. Let's pivot to Section 5, FP8, the performance baseline and hardware native dominance. So if extreme software compression is a trap, what is the right way to optimize? The answer is standard FP8 quantization, specifically using hardware-native 8-bit operations. FP8 gives you a really solid 2.0x capacity multiplier. But here's the critical difference. Because modern GPUs actually have native FP8 tensor cores built in, it quantizes both the storage and the math itself. There is literally no unzipping. It entirely avoids the dequantization trap, which results in negligible latency overhead, and it perfectly matches the accuracy of the uncompressed 16-bit baseline. It is for sure the absolute best default for production. Finally, Section 6, the final inference verdict. Choosing the right quantization. So, the crucial point is that when we break down all the numbers together, the final verdict is incredibly clear. FP8 doubles your capacity, perfectly matches your top speed, and keeps your accuracy highly stable. 4-bit gives you a substantial 3x capacity boost, but you pay for it with up to a 25% speed limit and a modest accuracy drop. Great for edge devices, but a compromise. But 3-bit, you get 3.7x capacity, but you absolutely tank your throughput by over 50% and cause a severe collapse in reasoning. This completely shatters the illusion that maximum compression automatically equals maximum speed. To cement this reality, let's look at the direct, unvarnished conclusion from the VLLM team's empirical analysis. They state clearly that TurboQuant, K3v4-NC, and 3-bit-NC show meaningful accuracy drops, rendering them unsuitable for production deployments. Plain and simple, they are just not worth the heavy performance tax they impose on your hardware. Which leaves me with a final, kind of provocative thought for you to chew on today. We've seen that the hardware fundamentally rebels when we try to squeeze complex intelligence into overly simplistic, lossy boxes. So if pushing silicon past its natural limits literally destroys its ability to reason, where do we look next for true scaling efficiency? Do we keep trying to compress the data, or is it time to completely reimagine the physical architecture itself? Think about that next time you sit down to optimize a model. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you on the next one.